In this lab, we're going to talk about oxidative rancidity in potato chips. There are a couple of things to consider just as a basic overview for this lab. This kind of breakdown of fats happens over time, and we're going to look at the effect of these changes in the taste and smell of potato chips. We're going to measure them, and it's going to be a very subjective measure, so you're going to use your senses and really create your own scale of the changes. And we're going to use this information kind of on the backdrop of looking at food packaging and how some of these different chips or different kinds of food products are packaged in ways that is going to either delay or hopefully prevent this kind of breakdown of fats. There are a couple of key terms with this lab. The main one is rancidity, and I want you to also understand the types of foods that would be more likely to undergo this kind of breakdown. You're going to be able to explain the need for controlling this, what we call oxidation of lipids or lipid oxidation for all different kinds of foods, but in particular with chips as they're being exposed to sunlight. I mentioned that we're going to use a subjective evaluation. In laboratory science, very often we use very objective measures, so this is a kind of a change for us. You're also going to prepare a graph, and we'll talk about that a little bit more because it will be included in your lab report. This will be the first time you're doing a lab report for the course, and so I'll mention that and a few things to keep in mind. So for this lab, I want you to assemble the materials. You're going to need some clear jars. So if you have some canning jars, that would be fine. But you don't have to do anything fancy. Don't go out and buy anything. If you have some drinking glasses at home, you could use those and just cover them with plastic wrap or something like that. The thing to avoid would be colored glass, so a glass that maybe is green or brown, or something that is not completely transparent, something that's like a milk glass. That won't let the light in quite as easily. I also want you to think about where you're going to keep your samples. Look for a sunny window. Generally, something that is south-facing is going to be a little sunnier than a north-facing window. So just watch the light patterns throughout the day. Just like any lab, you're going to track your results very carefully. You're going to notice smell and taste changes. So just like with the tasting lab, think about optimal tasting kind of environment. Probably not right before or right after a meal, and not after you've had something that's strongly flavored like mint or coffee. If there are questions that come up during the lab, certainly use our forum for questions. If you have a question, you can get it answered, and then also others can benefit from the explanation. A couple of notes about the data. You're going to be tracking these samples for 2 weeks. So this is a 2-week lab. Keep that in mind. Make sure that you have plenty of time to look at those samples every day or every other day. If you're going to wait for the weekend, you know, I'm not exactly sure how well that's going to interact with our lab. And by the end of those 2 weeks, you should have 14 days of data, and you're going to make a chart about the changes that you've seen in the potato chips. The work that needs to be done for this lab, obviously you're going to read the directions very carefully. You're going to participate in the lab discussion, but keep in mind that since this is a 2-week lab, we're going to be a little bit flexible with those due dates. Just make sure that you have completed the discussion, your initial post and 2 follow-ups, by the end of that 2nd week on Sunday evening. And you certainly don't have to have the lab completely finished in order to participate in the discussion. You also are going to do the journal assignment. And then, as I said earlier, this is going to be your first lab report, which is pretty exciting. There's an example that I've given you in this module. It's going to show you how to format, and then also the different headings that you'll have. So you'll have an introduction and overview. And keep in mind that you don't have to retype that information. You can just open up the procedures for the lab, that document, and copy and paste the information. However, if you make a change, certainly make sure that you note that in the procedures. You're going to follow a couple of grammar rules for lab reports, so we don't use contractions. So instead of didn't or don't, did not or do not. And then no personal pronouns. And this is really tricky. It's going to be a challenge for some of you, I'm sure, because we're used to talking in the first person. I did this. Instead, take yourself out of that equation. You know, you can talk about what was done or what happened in the lab without including yourself in it. In most disciplines in the science, we don't use personal pronoun or even a plural pronoun. We don't say we did this. We say it was done, or the procedures were followed instead of I followed the procedures. In a couple of disciplines, you might see that. You could see it potentially in some areas in public health and maybe in education, but generally that's something to avoid. You're also going to include your graph. If you need some help with the graph, if it's not something you feel completely confident constructing, I'll put up a link in the module that will give you a basic primer on graphing. This doesn't need to be overly fancy. You could do it on graph paper by hand. You could also do it with the computer. My only kind of comment would be that if you're going to do it by hand, make sure that it's legible, make sure that it's professional looking, and then you can take a picture of it and include that file with the lab report, even if it's separate. See if you could incorporate it into the lab report. That would be optimal. Okay, have fun.